He stood outside the glass tower in a jacket that didn't fit him anymore, holding a folded piece of paper with an address written in his own handwriting. He didn't know that in less than an hour, the most powerful woman in the building would look at his name on a job application, go pale, and have to sit down. He didn't know that 30 years ago, she had made him a promise, and she never forgot a promise. If this story touches your heart even a little, please stay with us until the end, because it only gets more powerful. And before we continue, if you believe in the power of kindness, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This channel is called Kindness Waves, and every single week we bring you true-to-life stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things with nothing but a good heart. If stories like this matter to you, you're exactly who we made this channel for. Now, let's begin. The city of Columbus, Ohio, was waking up slowly on a gray Tuesday morning in October. Steam rose from a coffee cart on the corner of 4th Street, and office workers hurried past with their heads down, scarves pulled up against the wind. In the middle of that crowd walked a man named Walter Combs, 61 years old, broad-shouldered but stooped now from years of hard labor, his hands rough and his eyes tired in the particular way that comes from carrying worry for a long, long time. Walter wasn't always tired like this. Once, he had been a young father with dreams as big as anybody's. He had worked in a steel plant for 22 years, the kind of job that built a person's whole life around it. A modest house, 2 kids raised with love, a wife named Dolores who made the best cornbread in the neighborhood, and who still, after 34 years of marriage, made him laugh every single day. But 3 years ago, the plant closed its doors for good. Overnight, 400 families lost their paychecks, and Walter Combs, a man who had never missed a day of work in over 2 decades, found himself standing in an unemployment line for the first time in his life. He tried everything. He drove for a rideshare app until his old truck broke down and he couldn't afford to fix it. He worked seasonal warehouse jobs that ended after the holidays. He applied to over 200 positions in 3 years, stocking shelves, driving delivery trucks, working security, and heard we've decided to go in another direction so many times that the words stopped hurting and just became noise. Meanwhile, Dolores's health had started to decline. Her heart wasn't what it used to be, and the medications weren't cheap. The mortgage on the little house on Willow Street was 2 months behind, and Walter lay awake most nights doing math in his head that never came out right. That morning, he had seen a notice on a community job board. Whitmore Technologies, a fast-growing software company that had taken over 3 floors of the old Beckman building downtown, was hiring for a night janitorial position. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what he'd dreamed of when he was young. But it was steady, it had benefits, and Walter Combs had learned, over the last 3 years, that pride doesn't pay the electric bill. So he put on his one good jacket, the same one he'd worn to his daughter's wedding 12 years ago, and he walked the 11 blocks downtown because he couldn't afford the bus fare that week. He didn't know that the woman whose name was on the building's directory, the CEO of Whitmore Technologies, was somebody he already knew. He didn't know that 30 years earlier, he had done something so small he'd nearly forgotten it himself. An act of kindness so ordinary to him that it barely registered as a memory. But for the person on the receiving end of it, that moment had never stopped mattering. Her name was Renata Ashworth, and in the year Walter Combs walked into that building, she was 43 years old and one of the most respected and most guarded executives in the tech industry. Whitmore Technologies had grown from a 2-person startup in her garage into a company worth over $4 billion, employing more than 3,000 people across the country. Business magazines called her brilliant, relentless, a visionary. What they didn't know, because she never spoke of it publicly, was where she came from. Renata had grown up in a rundown apartment complex on the east side of Columbus with a mother who worked double shifts at a diner and a father who left before Renata turned 6. Money was always short. Some winters, the heat got shut off. Some weeks, dinner was whatever her mother could bring home from the diner in a to-go container after a shift. Renata was a smart kid, sharp as a tack, but smart doesn't fill an empty stomach, and it doesn't keep a 13-year-old girl warm on a January night when the furnace has been disconnected because the bill wasn't paid. That particular January, when Renata was 13, was the coldest one Columbus had seen in a decade. Her mother had fallen behind on the heating bill after a stretch of reduced hours at the diner, and when the utility company shut off service, it happened on a Friday afternoon, which meant no one from the company would even look at the account again until Monday. Renata remembers that weekend more clearly than she remembers almost anything else from her childhood. She remembers wearing every piece of clothing she owned, layered on top of each other, sitting under 3 blankets on the couch with her mother, both of them shivering, watching their breath turn to fog in their own living room. On Saturday morning, there was a knock at the door. It was Walter Combs, a 31-year-old steelworker who lived 2 floors down with his wife and infant daughter. Walter didn't know the Ashworths well. A nod in the hallway, a good morning at the mailboxes, nothing more. But he'd noticed the night before that no lights were on in their apartment, and that morning he'd noticed frost forming on the inside of their window, which meant something was badly wrong. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He didn't make Renata's mother explain or feel ashamed. He simply said, "I've got a space heater we're not using, and I picked up extra firewood for the little stove out back. Let me bring some over." And he did. He carried over the space heater a stack of split firewood, 2 thick quilts his wife had made, and a pot of stew that his wife Dolores, newly married then, kind as anyone Renata would ever meet, had made a double batch of that morning, because, she said with a wink, "I always make too much anyway." Walter came back Sunday morning too, just to check the heater was working right and to drop off a few more logs. He never made a big deal of it. He never mentioned it again after that weekend. On Monday, the utility company reconnected the service, and life simply went back to whatever normal was for the Ashworth family. But Renata never forgot it. She was 13 years old, cold and scared and ashamed of being poor, and neighbors she barely knew had looked at her family not with pity, but with plain, unhurried kindness, the kind that doesn't ask for anything back and doesn't make you feel small for needing it. Renata used to say, much later in life, in the rare interviews where she let her guard down even slightly, that there is a particular kind of kindness that saved a life without anyone realizing a life was being saved. She never used Walter's name in those interviews. She never mentioned the building, the apartment, the specifics. It was hers to carry, privately, like a coal that never went cold. Life moved both families in different directions after that. The Ashworths moved out of the apartment complex 2 years later when Renata's mother got a better job managing the diner. Renata worked relentlessly through high school, earned a scholarship to Ohio State, studied computer science at a time when very few women were encouraged into the field, and clawed her way, year after year, toward the career that eventually became Whitmore Technologies. The Combs family, meanwhile, stayed rooted in Columbus. Walter worked at the steel plant for over 2 decades, raised 2 children, and lived a quiet, steady, unremarkable life. The kind of life that doesn't make headlines but holds up entire communities. Until the plant closed. Until the last 3 years happened. Neither of them had spoken to each other, or even seen each other, in over 3 decades. Now, back to that gray Tuesday morning. Walter walked into the lobby of the old Beckman building, which now had a sleek sign out front reading Whitmore Technologies in brushed silver letters. He straightened his jacket, cleared his throat, and approached the front desk, where a young woman in a headset greeted him. "I'm here about the janitorial position," Walter said. "I saw the posting on the community board." The young woman, whose name tag read Priya, smiled warmly. "Of course, HR is on the 4th floor, but I can take your application here if you have it filled out." Walter handed over the paper application he'd carefully filled out the night before at his kitchen table. Dolores looking over his shoulder, both of them hoping this would be the one. Priya scanned it quickly, checking for completeness the way she'd been trained to. Name, Walter James Combs. Address, Willow Street. References, 2 former supervisors from the steel plant. "Looks good," Priya said. "I'll walk this up to HR myself. They're doing final interviews for this position today, actually. You might get to meet with someone right away, if you have a few minutes." Walter said he had all the time in the world, though the words tasted a little bitter in his mouth, because having all the time in the world wasn't a luxury, it was the exhausting result of unemployment. Priya asked him to have a seat, and she carried the application folder up to the 4th floor, where the HR department kept a small stack of finalist applications on the corner of a desk, ready for a final review before an offer letter went out. What Priya didn't know, and what almost nobody at Whitmore Technologies knew, was that Renata Ashworth had a habit, a strange little quirk that her assistant had learned to work around over the years. Once or twice a month, when she had a rare open hour in her schedule, Renata liked to personally review a handful of applications for entry-level and support staff positions, especially night shift roles. She never explained why to her HR team, and they never asked. Some executives like to feel connected to the ground floor of their company, so nobody thought much of it. It made her seem humble, approachable, different from the typical Silicon Valley executive. The real reason was simpler and far more personal, and she'd never told a single person at the company. Every time she looked over one of those applications, she was quietly hoping, in a part of her heart she rarely let herself examine, that someday she might see a name she recognized. She didn't know why she still hoped for it after 30 years. She just did. That Tuesday afternoon, her assistant, a sharp and efficient young man named Devin, brought her a small folder with 3 finalist applications for the night janitorial position, along with her coffee, exactly the way she liked it, and a reminder that she had a board call in 40 minutes. 3 finalists for the janitorial opening, Devin said, setting the folder on her desk. HR already did the phone screens. Any of them would be solid. First one's got the strongest references. Thank you, Devin, Renata said, not looking up from her laptop screen, where she was finishing an email to an investor. I'll take a look before the board call. Devin left, and Renata continued typing for another minute or two before she finally set the laptop aside and reached for the folder. This was her ritual, and she rarely thought too hard about why she kept doing it. She flipped open the folder and looked at the first application. Name, Walter James Combs. For a moment, nothing happened. Names are just names, after all, and Combs isn't an unusual last name. Renata's eyes moved automatically to the address line, the way they always did, an old habit from childhood, checking to see if anyone she knew still lived nearby. Willow Street. Her hand froze on the paper. It wasn't the same address as the old apartment complex, of course. 30 years had passed, and people move. But something about the combination, the name Walter, the surname Combs, made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt in years. She told herself it was probably nothing. Combs was a common enough name. There were probably a dozen Walter Combses in Ohio. She almost closed the folder and moved on to the next application, the way any busy CEO with a board call in 38 minutes would. But her eyes drifted down to the reference section, where the applicant had listed his previous employer. Heartline Steel Manufacturing, 22 years, floor supervisor for the last 8. And beneath that, in the space for additional notes that HR always asked applicants to fill involuntarily, Walter had written, in his own careful handwriting, I have always believed in showing up and doing right by people, even when it isn't asked of me. That's the kind of worker I've tried to be my whole life. Renata sat completely still for a long moment. Her office, usually filled with the low hum of her own focused energy, felt suddenly very quiet. She picked up her desk phone and pressed the button for Devin's line. Devin, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The first applicant for the janitorial position. Is he still downstairs? I believe so, Devin said. Priya said he came in this morning. Bring him up to my office. Now, please. Before the board call, there was a pause on the line. Your office? For a janitorial interview. Yes, Devin. Please. Devin, to his credit, didn't ask further questions, though he was certainly curious. He went down to the lobby, found Walter Combs sitting patiently in a chair by the window, still holding his folded jacket in his lap, even though he was already wearing it, a nervous habit he didn't realize he had. Mr. Combs, Devin said, Ms. Ashworth would like to speak with you directly. If you'll follow me. Walter blinked, confused. Ms. Ashworth, you mean the CEO? That's right. Walter's stomach dropped a little. In 3 years of job hunting, he had never once been asked to meet with a company CEO for a janitorial position. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Had he made a mistake on the application? Had something on his background check raised a flag? Was there some problem he didn't know about? He followed Devin into the elevator, his heart pounding harder with each floor that ticked by. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Walter found himself in a wide open space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Columbus, sleek modern furniture, walls decorated with framed photographs of the company's early years. It was in every way a different world from the one he'd walked out of that morning. Devin led him down a short hallway to a glass-walled office at the corner of the building and gestured for him to go in. Walter stepped inside, holding his jacket a little tighter, and saw a woman standing by the window with her back to him, looking out over the city. She was dressed simply for someone in her position, a dark blazer, hair pulled back. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth, though Walter had read enough news to know exactly who she was. "Ms. Ashworth," he said, a little unsteady. "Walter Combs. I appreciate you taking the time, ma'am. I know you're busy." She turned around slowly, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Walter looked at her face, and something flickered in the back of his mind. A strange, distant familiarity he couldn't quite place, the way you might recognize a song you haven't heard in decades before you remember its name. Renata looked at him, at the lines time had carved into his face, at the tired kindness still visible in his eyes, and she felt 30 years collapse into a single moment. "Willow Street," she said quietly. "You used to live on the 3rd floor of the Larkspur Apartments. 2 floors up from us." Walter's brow furrowed. "Yes, ma'am, a long time ago, before it got torn down." "How did you?" "You brought us a space heater," Renata said, her voice catching slightly. "In January. The heat had been shut off. You brought firewood, and your wife made stew, and you came back the next morning just to check on the heater." Walter stared at her, and slowly, the fog of 30 years began to lift. He remembered a thin, serious little girl who used to sit on the stairwell landing reading library books, because it was the only quiet place in a crowded building. He remembered a tired but proud mother who tried to refuse the firewood at first, out of pride, before finally accepting it with tears in her eyes. He remembered Dolores insisting on bringing over a second pot of stew a few days later, just because. "Renata," he said softly, testing the name like it was something fragile. "Little Renata from 2B. You used to sit and do your homework on the stairs." "Because it was the only place with decent light," she said, and her eyes were shining now. "You probably don't even remember it. It was such a small thing to you." "I remember your mother," Walter said. "Worked at that diner on 5th. Hardest working woman I ever met, besides my own wife." He shook his head slowly, disbelief washing over his tired face. "I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea that was you." Renata gestured for him to sit down, and for the next several minutes, the CEO of a $4 billion technology company and the 61-year-old man who had come in hoping for a night janitor position sat together, not as employer and applicant, but as two people whose lives had crossed once, briefly, at the coldest and hardest moment of one of their childhoods. "You have no idea what that weekend meant to me," Renata said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, not caring, for once, about composure. "I was 13 years old. I was cold and scared and ashamed that we couldn't pay our bills. And you didn't make me feel ashamed. You just helped. Like it was nothing. Like it was just what neighbors do." "It was what neighbors do," Walter said simply. "Still is, far as I'm concerned. World's gotten more complicated since then, but that part hasn't changed, not for me." Renata leaned forward. "I've spent 30 years building this company, Walter. I have given speeches about resilience, about hard work, about believing in people. And every single time, in the back of my mind, I have thought about that weekend. About a space heater and a pot of stew. I used to wonder, sometimes, whatever happened to the man who did that for us. I never imagined I'd get to ask him myself." Walter sat quietly for a moment, absorbing all of this, still not quite able to believe the turn his ordinary Tuesday had taken. "Life's had its ups and downs since then," he admitted. "Plant I worked at for 22 years, closed a few years back. Been trying to find steady work ever since. That's why I'm here today. Actually, saw the janitorial listing, thought it looked like honest work." Something shifted in Renata's expression, something fierce and determined that her employees would have recognized instantly from 1,000 boardroom negotiations. "Walter," she said, "I am not going to insult you by pretending this is still a simple job interview. But I want to be very clear about something first because I need you to understand it.